Um, how's it going, everybody? We will go ahead and get started. Welcome to Photos at Zoom. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, perfect. So since we're all in quarantine and many of us are resorting to either staying inside or doing our isolated nature walks, we thought it'd be a good idea to do the next one about landscape and place. So I'm going to keep the chat box open. So if you have any questions, leave them there. And if I don't get to them and they like get too far up, just write it again and I'll be able to make sure that I look at it. So my name is Jordan Putt. I'm a second year grad student at Columbia College Chicago, and I am also a curatorial assistant at the MoCP. Today I'm actually doing this from beautiful Tucson, Arizona. So yeah, let's get started. So typically the way that we would order these things is like very fluid with the audience deciding the order that we go in. But since this is all online, I decided that I would try to take us through like a little bit of the history of landscape photography through what we have in our collection. So as many of you know, we are technically a contemporary photography museum, but and we only started collecting works starting in the 1980s. But we have been lucky enough to acquire some really old works, and part of which have become part of our collection, which now has around 16,000 objects in it. And this work is actually our oldest that we have, and it was taken by George N. Bernard in 1964. So this is actually an albumin silver print, which is the printing style where they actually had to like coat the paper with egg whites and then silver nitrate among like other chemicals. It was one of the first processes of printing, and oh yeah, and it was shot in 1864. Sorry. And it was one of the first processes of actually mass producing photographic prints. And it was huge during the 1870s. And there was this company called the Dresden Albuminizing Company, which in the height of things, they were said to have used 60,000 eggs every day, which I think is insane to think about when it's hard enough to find like a dozen eggs on the grocery store shelf right now. And all of these eggs were like cracked open manually, and then they would separate the yolks and the egg whites and then sell the yolks to like leather workers in the area. But a little bit about George Bernard. He owned a daguerreotype studio in Oswego, New York, and eventually moved to New York City, where he worked with Matthew Brady, who was a portrait photographer. And Matthew Brady actually went on to photograph the Civil War, and Bernard as well went on to photograph the Civil War. So Bernard was following the Union Army and eventually published a book of 61 albumin silver prints called Photographic Views of the Sherman Campaign. And he actually, the whole book was following General William Sherman on his march from Tennessee to the sea. And this image is actually a page from the book. And I believe that the binding was like pretty fragile on it, so the pages ended up coming out on these books. So most of these that are in collections around the world are just pages from that book. So this image was taken the day after the Battle of Atlanta, when Union troops defeated Confederate forces in the city. And it's worth noting that like these early Civil War photographs were never actually photographs of the battles, and that was just literally due to a limitation in their like photographic equipment, because they were shooting on tripods with like big boxy field cameras. They a lot of times the exposures were minutes long, and they would usually like make the negative and it would take around 45 minutes for it to set, and they were using all glass negatives. So everything that you see is usually like the remnants of a battlefield, and usually, and sometimes they would actually like add things in to make the battlefield more dramatic. So one thing that and something to note about that is like, if we think of the famous Roger Fenton photograph of like all the cannonballs that they then figured out was fake, like that's one of those images that really started to make us realize that these photographers might have been staging more than we might have expected. One thing that I came across about Bernard's work, which is really interesting to me, is that he would actually make separate cloud negatives, which he would pair with these photographs. Because if we're thinking about the technology at the time and the long exposures that they had to use, they would often have to overexpose the sky in order to get like the landscape to be exposed properly. So he would then go in and reprint these photographs with this other negative of clouds. So as you can tell, this one isn't actually one of those negatives, but I found one from the Getty collection that is supposedly taken on exactly the same day, and which is also called Battlefield of Atlanta, and July 22nd, 1864, and this is number 2. But you can see how like he actually put in the clouds. And it's a really interesting thing that he's doing that, because he's literally making the print in 2 separate sessions. So he had to print either the clouds first or the landscape first, and then print the other one second, because he's using the glass negatives. And the way that these were printed were literally contact prints. So he would put the negative on the paper, expose it, and then change it out and put the actual landscape on the paper to expose it. And so you can see here, it's like the one from the MoCP, which does not have the clouded negative added to it, and then this one from the Getty, which does. And something that I learned about this book is that it was fairly random on the ones that he would add the clouds to. So in different books, different scenes have clouds, and some scenes will have the same clouds as other scenes. So there's kind of like a lot of variation in these within the collections that they're collected in. So next, we're going to look at William Henry Jackson. And while Jackson actually wasn't photographing during the Civil War, he was in the Union Army. He began photographing afterwards and eventually got hired by Ferdinand Hayden to photograph for their survey of Wyoming in 1871. As a result of Jackson's images of Yellowstone, which were like the first images to provide indisputable proof of the like insane landscape that was there, Congress decided to protect Yellowstone as a national park in 1872. And this is interesting also because they would typically go with painters, and the painters would usually paint these like really romantic versions of the landscape. But because the medium of photography was considered this like very like evidential and documentary medium, it was this trusted source for them to see that the landscape really was this way. I also like pointing out this ability for this photograph to actually cause such political change and create a national park, because I think there is like, we are currently losing faith in the power of photography as a tool for change. And like theorists such as Susan Sontag would probably attribute that to like our overconsumption of images of suffering, which is maybe a discussion for another time, but I do think this is like a really interesting early example of photographs causing real change. And again, these photographs are made with a pretty wild amount of equipment. So his equipment probably totals around 300 pounds. And again, he's using like a big field camera and glass plates, and they're like hiking through some pretty rough terrain. So he has to make sure that he doesn't break any of the plates. And when he's doing the negative, he's actually, the whole process takes about 45 minutes between taking it to like exposing it and developing it for the image to set on the negative. And Jackson went on to photograph with the Hayden surveys for about 8 years before going on to make like photographs for real companies and for himself to start selling. While we don't actually have a lot of this work from the first Hayden surveys, we primarily have his photochrome prints which are pretty incredible in themselves. Photochrome was a process of making several lithographic limestone plates with the negative to add color to the black and white images. So they would use several different colors and then eventually turn it into this color image. So these were basically the first color photographs and the first mass-produced color photographs. So you can see these two versions, and there was monochrome photochromes. So I believe that is the one that's on the left. And the one on the right is a photochrome as well, and that is with the many colored lithographic plates. And so yes, these both are photochromes. So Jackson's images, again, were the first images that were turned into photochrome prints. And that's because he went to work with the Detroit photography company. And this company, the owner of the company, actually went to Switzerland where the photochrome process was developed. And he got the rights to bring this process to the US. And so these photographs were literally the first ones ever done in this process in the US. And so they would make these prints on tiny pieces of paper and actually sold them as postcards. And you can see on the bottom left, they put a little caption with the area. And this image in real life is actually a matter of a few inches tall. And another really interesting thing about these images is that Jackson brought over his archive of over 10,000 images when he was brought in to work with this company. So some of them we might not know the dates for, but they were producing photochromes of a huge archive of his images. And these were sent around the world as postcards. So who knows how many of these still exist. So this is a photochrome of the Mount Holy Cross in Colorado, which is also my background for me talking, which is another one that was done by William Henry Jackson. And although this one was taken in 1901, his earliest photographs of the Mount Holy Cross in August 1973 were super significant because they kind of provided the first proof of the existence of this mountain. And you could only photograph the actual cross in the mountain during a certain time of year. And until he had photographed it, it was just a matter of folklore. And many people had talked about this mountain in the region. Some people had actually died trying to see it. And so his photographs became the first proof of its existence. And it also, to many, became this symbol of that supported this idea of manifest destiny. It was almost this idea that many saw it as God wanted us to continue expanding to the West. And so it was this spiritual sign that we needed to keep going. Any questions thus far? Oh, that's good to know. Many of his photographs were also appropriated from other photographers. All right, so we'll move on. So next we're going to talk about Ansel Adams. And I think it's important to just kind of acknowledge the elephant in the room, that many of these earliest landscape photographers who have been praised throughout photographic history were white men. And it's a little awkward for me to only be talking about white men for the first few slides, but just bear with me because I promise that we're going to have a diverse set of image makers by the time we get to the end of this thing. But Ansel Adams' documentation of the Western landscape became really iconic. He was one of the defining periods of both the American West and just the photographic medium in general. He frequently photographed images within the national park systems, and they would often be used to promote tourism and preservation of these landscapes. Compositionally, he would tend to frame them so that the monuments in the nature looked super iconic. And in doing this, he also avoided including signs of tourists or habitation or any kind of man-made objects within a lot of these scenes. So a little bit about Adams is he was born in San Francisco in 1902. He originally studied to be a pianist, but he eventually got a camera and became really drawn to photographing the Yosemite Valley. He joined the Sierra Club in 1919, where he actually lived working as a keeper of one of their lodges. So he was living in Yosemite and photographing during this time. And then he eventually started to accompany their hikes that the club would do together. And he became the official photographer for the Sierra Club in 1927. One thing to note about Adams is that he worked tirelessly as like an environmental activist. He successfully advocated for the government expansion of many national parks, including Yellowstone and Yosemite. And he often brought his photographs to meetings with politicians and policymakers. So he literally gifted prints to President Ford, President Carter, and Reagan, all in in-person meetings. And he actually even like had letter conversations with them that we were able to access. So he was very much in contact with them, and it shows a lot about like his status at the time, where he was able to get this access to talk to some of these people with so much power. One thing to think about with this work is that some of the images might have been actually like somewhat counterproductive, because in an effort to photograph these like natural monumental structures, it also drastically increased tourism in these places, which may have started to actually impact them. But his commitment to like environmentalism is undeniable, and like the preservation of these places as national park. His contributions were so big that Yosemite actually named a mountain after him. He was also one of the most technically proficient image makers of his time. He was often consulted by a lot of the famous photographers around the time, such as Edward Weston and Paul Strand. He also developed the zone system, which was like the system for exposing images with hopes of controlling each level of light and dark tones of the image. And I think that this deserves like a whole lecture in itself, but I was reading a little bit about it, and they were saying that part of it was you would meter for the shadows, and then because the meter was looking for middle gray, you would lower that exposure that it gave you by 2 or 3 stops to get it in the proper zone where you still could have that shadow detail, but then it wouldn't overexpose the bright spots. But again, I think that is some deeper reading for all of us, and it deserves its own little lecture. He also founded the group F64 with Edward Weston and a few other California photographers. And their whole focus was making images that elevated the camera's like extremely descriptive qualities. If we think about like the pictorialism that was happening at the time, which was very like painterly, this was kind of this like really doubling down on the medium and using its extremely descriptive quality to their benefit. So also a lot of his images are using the aperture f64 to get the maximum depth of field that they could get. I really like bringing in this image too, because I think it shows just how like sophisticated Adams was with using the zone system and with printing, where we don't lose any of the detail in the shadows, and we still get to see this tiny little horse silhouette in the bottom of the photograph. And I think that for me totally makes the image. So this is the last Adams image that I'll include, and I wanted to bring this in the lecture just to talk about like some of the collaborations that he did. So this one was actually a collaboration with Dorothea Lange, and originally we had this image on our website attributed to Dorothea Lange, but our researcher reached out recently and told us that he had found the negative and that he was positive that it was Adams' image. But then I was going through our collection and I noticed this image, which was taken from the exact same spot. It must have been more of like a telephoto lens, but we still have this one attributed to Lange. But reading up about this work, I found out that it was actually a collaborative piece that they both did together for Life magazine called Three Mormon Towns, and it was published in 1954. And neither of these photos actually made the cut. And it's a really interesting project because the authorship is pretty blurred. So even when it's published, you don't know who took what image. And this, I believe that this collaboration stems from a long relationship between Adams and Lang. And for example, Lang wasn't a huge fan of printing, so she would often outsource some of her printing to Adams starting in the 30s. And I like looking at them side by side because we can even see how the difference in how they were shot. So the one on the left looks like it must have been using a wider lens. And so the interesting thing about these works also is we cannot be totally sure that Lang actually photographed the one on the right. And that's because we acquired all these prints in a big donation from Lang's stepdaughter. So we originally attributed it all to Lang, but as we've kind of gone through it, we don't know some of these images. We don't quite know who may have been the real photographer, especially in a project like this. And because we have this collection of her work, we also got tons of her work prints and her test prints. So it's a really rich collection. And if anyone actually saw our recent show, Go Down Moses, curated by Teju Cole, he included a lot of these, like the test prints in different versions of the same image that Lang had made. I also like this collaboration because it does seem like the two titans of photography coming together to make a project. And I think that their collaboration even went further. So in 1945, Ansel Adams founded the photography department at the San Francisco Art Institute, and he hired on Lang to work as a faculty member there. And something else that is crazy to think about is that the San Francisco Art Institute just announced that they're going to be suspending their all degree programs and classes as a result of what's going on right now. So it's pretty crazy to think about what the implications of what's going on now to this history that goes like really far back in photography. So this is another image from Three Mormon Towns, and this one was actually published in the Life magazine article, and I have a link to the magazine that was published in that I will include at the end of the lecture. And my guess is that this one was taken by Lang because it seems very much like Lang's style. She was a very documentary style. She loved portraiture. And while I could probably do like a full lecture on Lang, I'll just note a few things about her. So she photographed for the Farm Security Administration during the 30s, and she made the famous migrant mother image, which I won't include here, but I'm sure it will be included in a future photos at Zoom. And she was also the first female photographer to receive a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1941. And her plan was to photograph in rural America for 12 months, but she ended up giving up the award after the bombing of Pearl Harbor to work for the US government photographing the Japanese American internment camps. And my guess, I haven't been able to find this out for sure, but I have a suspicion that this collaboration may have been one of her ways of revisiting her ideas that she didn't get to accomplish with the Guggenheim grant. And lastly, I wanted to include this one by Lang because, for one, it is not from a collaborative project, so it is undeniably hers. And it also hits on like this typical trope that we would see with photographing landscapes, especially now. But in my opinion, I think this might be the best like photograph looking down the middle of a road that I've ever seen. But yeah, like I said, Lang deserves a much longer lecture, and she will likely be brought up in future photos at Zoom. Are there any other questions here? All right, we'll keep going. So next we're going to look at Joseph Jachna's images. Jacna was a student at the Institute of Design in Chicago, which I think we've talked about it before, but the Institute of Design, or the ID, was a pretty famous school because it was considered the new Bauhaus in its inception. So Laszlo Moholy-Nagy came to Chicago, started the school, and then eventually hired Callahan and Siskind, and it became a really notable program for photography. And I really love Jacquemin's work because he really uses like the camera's distinct ability to describe the world in extreme detail to really disrupt our perceptions of the world. So if we consider like the medium photography and its inherent documentary qualities, I mean, we think of William Henry Jackson's documents. Jacquemin's photos can start to challenge that notion because he's purposely disrupting the images with his own body and making us really consider how the photographer is like changing these images. So his photographs become much less about the thing itself and more about how that thing can be disrupted by the photographer's tools. So this is part of his Door County, Wisconsin series, which I believe was one of his most well-known series. And in this image, he's actually holding a little mirror and shooting it with a fisheye lens. But I love it because he kind of disrupts our reality with the mirror, but then gives us the hints to kind of like figure out this disruption by including his arm. And I also love how the arm kind of starts to blend with the road and creates the other edge of it. This is another image by Jacquemin, which I also wanted to include just because it again kind of repositions our perspective so that we can see what we may have missed just by looking with our naked eye. So a colleague of mine, Levi Shand, taught me about this term, which is called pareidolia, which is essentially when we see like patterns or faces in random information. And I mean, I think about like when a few years back, someone like saw Jesus in their toast, or even in like William Henry Jackson's image of the cross, how it's clearly just a rock face, but then if we're looking for that structure, then we see the cross. So I also think that Jacquemin was really considering some of these concepts, even if he may not have like consciously stated the term, because I love how this becomes, the shadow almost becomes like the silhouette of a face. And I also really enjoy how he includes himself to kind of shift the perspective. So a curve, which would typically be tiny, looks like monumental, and then his body looks like very small in comparison. And I also just love pointing out that his hair is just like blowing in the wind. So next we're gonna look at Robert Adams. And Robert Adams, no relation to Ansel Adams, but they are like an interesting two to compare in their ideals about landscape photography. So they likely have like aligned environmental views, but Robert Adams' photographs of the landscape had quite a different take on what was important to show. So unlike Ansel Adams, who prioritized like these untouched, beautiful landscapes, Adams focused on images that showed like the intersection between humans and the natural landscape. I found a publication that was done by the University of Virginia in 2013, which I will include the link of after this lecture as well. But I love a quote that they said. So they said, according to Robert Adams, landscape photography too often acted as a technology of exclusion, obscuring more than it revealed. The genre upheld a static ideal of pure, pristine wilderness that worked to alienate viewers from the more modest, ordinary landscapes in which they lived and worked. And Robert Adams actually responds to this idea in a quote in his 1974 series, The New West. And he says, many have asked, pointing incredulously toward a sweep of tract homes and billboards, why picture that? The question sounds simple, but it implies a difficult issue. Why open our eyes anywhere but in undamaged places like national parks? One reason is, of course, that we do not live in parks, that we need to improve things at home, and that to do it, we have to see the facts without blinking. I've always thought this image was a pretty wonderful job of like acknowledging the beauty within these natural elements, while also being pretty frank about the context that they're existing in, which in this case is like a smoggy California expressway with power lines and concrete running next to it. There's a quote that I wasn't able to find, but I remember hearing it. It's something along the lines of like showing affection for the world without lying about it. And I think that Robert Adams does that incredibly well in his images. So this one I included just because I think it is one of my favorite images in the collection. I love the way that he just uses our perspective to kind of confuse the size of the mountain. Like it becomes this very fluid thing, and the poles kind of like, they become a way to something that we can use for scale, but we can't actually use it for scale because their perspective is skewed as well. And then the tire tracks become almost the most monumental thing in the image. So Robert Adams was also a big theorist about photography. Oh, someone wants me to repeat the quote about the exclusionary landscape. So I'll read you what they said again. So, according to Robert Adams, landscape photography too often as a technology of exclusion, obscuring more than it revealed, the genre upheld a static ideal of pure, pristine wilderness that worked to alienate viewers from the more modest, ordinary landscapes in which they lived and worked. One thing about Adams too is that he's written a lot of books about photography. One of my favorites is called Beauty in Photography. So he has a lot of like pretty good quotes. My favorite quote, which is not theoretical at all from him, is "No place is boring if you had a good night's sleep and have a pocket full of unexposed film." And I guess I couldn't agree more. And that quote, sorry, I misread your question. That quote is actually came from a book that was published by the University of Virginia. And I'll include a link to it. I don't remember exactly who the author was of that specific essay, but I have a link to the entire book that I'll include at the end of this lecture or on the site after this lecture is over. So now, many of you might have been waiting for me to mention this, but Robert Adams was also a part of the groundbreaking exhibition in 1975, which was the New Topographics exhibition. And that took place at the George Eastman House and became super influential to the genre of landscape photography. The exhibition was curated by William Jenkins and included Robert Adams, Louis Baltz, Joe Deal, Frank Golke, Nicholas Nixon, John Scott, Stephen Shore, Henry Wessel Jr., and Burton Hillebesher. And according to Jenkins' introduction, this is a quote from him. The pictures were stripped of any artistic frills and reduced to an essentially topographic state, conveying substantial amounts of visual information, but eschewing entirely the aspects of beauty, emotion, and opinion. And I was actually reading somewhere that a few of the photographers had a problem with this statement because they did not agree that they were devoid of beauty, emotion, or opinion. But I think that could just be deeper reading for all of us. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of images from the actual exhibition, but we have collected many of these artists' work throughout their careers. So, for example, this one is by Henry Wessel, and the photographer of this image actually also had a solo show at the MoMA in 1972, and this was 3 years before the New Topographic exhibition. So this is also another one of my favorite images from the collection. And I just love how he turns like these two otherwise completely banal moments of like a flock of pigeons flying and a guy on his afternoon walk to like this epic suburban standoff between the pigeons and the guy. And they look like they're on the brink of converging. And I also like to think of Henry Wessel as like, if we think of photography as a language, I would say that Wessel was focused on describing like a very, the dialect of like the American West and specifically the Bay Area. So he was often looking at simple residential scenes and landscapes. And if we think about this vernacular of the American West, I also wanted to include this image because he also focused quite a bit on these bushes and shrubs in the Bay Area. And he would always kind of make these formal compositions, much like we expect of portraiture. And to me, they almost become these portraits of the people who inhabit the spaces like that are adjacent to them. If anyone's interested in his work as well, there's some pretty great videos of him speaking about his work, and he's super passionate, so I can post those as well. And I'll look at some of your questions too. So someone asked about Joseph Jacquesne. Were those concepts based in Bauhaus? And if so, what other concepts were taken from the Bauhaus? I think that they were, they were based in Bauhaus in the way that they followed it through on much of the teachings. So the Bauhaus was focused on creating like this idea of this universal design that could go across all different art mediums. And with photography, like the teachers at the time being Callahan and Siskin, they were really focused on making like using the camera's ability to like describe, to like start to actually play with that tool as part of the medium. So using the camera as this tool to obstruct what we're seeing. But I don't know if he's like pulling directly from like certain Bauhaus principles per se, but I think it is very much like working with a lot of these design elements and playing with like the tools to make these designs. Oh, I like that. That Tim Burton might have been influenced by this. All right, so we'll move on. So the last new topographics photographer that I wanted to look at today is Frank Goelke. And this image is part of his series of grain elevators that were published in his book, Measure of Emptiness. So Frank's work to me is rather poetic, and he uses the square format. And this is before Instagram like imposed that format on all of us. But Frank has written extensively about photography, and I just wanted to read a little quote from him in how he wrote about his draw to these actual grain elevators. So he says, "The place encouraged fantasies of lost worlds and vanished empires, of abandoned cities whose makers' intentions were utterly inscrutable to me. The grain elevator's resemblance to habitable architecture, however, only serves to dramatize the differences. The windowless, largely unbroken expanses of concrete or corrugated steel, 10 or more stories tall and hundreds of feet long, produce a strange sense of dislocation when one is near them." So like many others of the new topographics exhibition, Goelke often framed the landscape as an artifact of how humans exist, kind of illustrating that convergence between like the human and natural world. And yes, I couldn't find for sure, but I do believe that he was definitely influenced by the Beckers because they were working very much in this same indexical approach. And they were also a part of the new topographics exhibition. So great question. So one of the things that I think really comes through in his work too is like this fragility and temporality of humans, which considering like the current time period, I think is really resonant with what's going on in the world. And this next image I included because I also think that it resonates in the same way. And yes, I will include, I can include these quotes as well as links to where I found a lot of them after the talk. So great recommendation. So this is the last image I wanted to show of Frank's work, and it's from his series documenting the aftermath of the Mount St. Helens eruption. I chose this work because I think that it like visually, it can be very reminiscent to the early images of some of the early like photographers making images of survey expeditions or Ansel Adams, but it functions quite differently than the work of Ansel Adams because, like his images of the grain elevators, Golke's really interested in these like physical disruptions that make up the landscape. So they may not always be human caused. So in this case, it was actually like the eruption that is the disruption, and which completely altered the landscape that was around Mount St. Helens. And before I move on, I don't know if he's actually watching, but I figured I would plug our faculty member at Columbia College Chicago, who wrote one of the defining books about the new topographics or edited and included essays in this book, and that's Gregory Foster Rice. So if you're interested in learning more, please check out Reframing the New Topographics. And Greg is a wealth of knowledge, so you won't be disappointed. All right, realizing I got to speed up here. So next we have the work of Marilyn Bridges. And as you guys might have guessed, she is making these aerial photographs long before the creation of drones, and long before we had the technological ease that we do today to make these type of images. She began this work upon seeing the Nazca lines in Peru, and actually went on to teach herself to be a pilot, and she's now credentialed to fly single and multi-engine land and sea aircrafts, and she even owns her own aircraft, though she says she never pilots them when she's making images. Her work seems to go beyond like just a simple documentation of the landscape and really focuses on these patterns and physical changes that humans have been creating for centuries that we rarely got to see from above. So she would photograph like contemporary landscapes like this one, as well as very ancient landscapes, which we'll look at next. And because her work requires like this like formal perfection to get the tones and compositions that can really go beyond being this simple documentation, she would wait for the perfect light and then direct the pilot to fly at a super low altitude at a specific angle and as slow as possible without stalling the plane. And I was reading up on her, and she was actually using a Pentax 6.7 camera, which, as far as I know, is the only 6.7 camera that was made or that I've seen that could shoot at 1,000th of a second. So in order to shoot this at this shutter speed, she was also pushing her film. So she was using Tri-X, I believe, and just pushing it so that she could actually shoot at 1,000th of a second. So this is another image that Bridges took in Peru of an ancient irrigation network. And this was actually part of a larger body of work that she made during a Fulbright scholarship in Peru. And in this one, we can really see like how these ancient creations by humans become completely different when viewed from the sky. And they almost become like this documentation of these ancient symbols that many may not have ever expected to be seen. I think a lot about like the Nazca lines, which are these lines or essentially like drawings in the landscape that can only be seen from above, but no one has an explanation for how they got there. And I really love how she's using some of these more utilitarian creations in the landscape to also look at how they can become larger symbols. And I don't know the exact altitudes, but I do know that she had to fly extremely low to get a lot of these. But I'm sure that the altitude changes depending on whatever she is photographing. All right, so we'll move on. So next we're going to look at the work of Mark Klett. And many of you might know him from his work in the Rephotographic Survey Project. So similar to the new topographics photographers, he was really interested in tracking like the changes in the human impact on the land. But it may not have only been the human impact, it was also like the impact of erosion and other things like that. So what he did is he recreated photographs from some of these early photography and survey expeditions of the 1800s, of photographers such as like Timothy O'Sullivan or William Henry Jackson, who we mentioned earlier. And to do this, he would actually try to go to the exact same place at the exact same date and the same time of day and re-photograph from the same perspective to visualize these changes. So many of the previous landscapes weren't even visible because of like new buildings or erosion. But if you're interested in that work, we don't have a ton of examples of that in our collection, but I just wanted to mention it. But he did put out a book called Second Views, where you get to see that comparison, and it's a really interesting comparison. But I wanted to kind of give that preface because this work works very much in the same vein. So for this project, Klett re-photographed from the top of the California Street Hill in San Francisco, creating a panorama of 13 images that recreated the same panorama that was made by Edward Muybridge with his wooden camera 112 years earlier. And both of them were using giant field cameras when they did this. The only difference is that Klett was using silver gelatin prints and Muybridge was using albumin prints. Many of the like art history nerds here might recognize Muybridge because he was also the person who did the motion studies of the horse to see that when they would be with all four legs off the ground. A fact that I learned about Muybridge, which blew my mind also that I had never heard, is that he shot and killed his wife's lover and got acquitted because the jury called it a justifiable homicide. But I think that's another discussion. So Muybridge actually chose this location because initially it was the tallest point in San Francisco, which had become a major city as a result of the gold rush. So to put in perspective, over the 30 years prior to this photo, the population grew from 50,000 to more than 200,000 people. And this is the two put together. And I grabbed this from Mark Klett's website. So if we can view them together, the top one is Muybridge's panorama, and the bottom is Klett's. We can see how for one, the city has grown exponentially in the 112 years. And now we all know that San Francisco is one of the most expensive cities to live in the nation. And something to note is that the top image was shot from the tower of the Mark Hopkins mansion. And Klett wasn't able to access this point because the mansion burnt down in 1906 and was rebuilt as a giant luxury hotel. So he went to the 16th floor of the hotel and walked out on the terrace to make the images. And also another thing is that both panoramas contain 13 frames, but as you can tell, Klett wasn't physically able to shoot the furthest left frame. So his panorama goes one more frame to the right of what Muybridge's was. And like I said, the top is albumin prints and the bottom is the silver gelatin prints. And this was also turned into a book that was titled One City, Two Visions. And I believe this one, as well as the earlier book that I mentioned, they both go for a reasonable price on like the used market. So next, I wanted to take a look at a more contemporary photographer whose work we recently acquired at the museum as part of our 2019 Snyder Prize. He actually won our honorable mention, so we collected 2 of his works. And in his series titled Wild Beasts, this is done by Peter Cochran. And he creates still lifes in front of a pop-up studio set up within like a larger landscape. And these still lifes begin to serve as portraits for various members of his community. And he's a member of the LGBTQI community. So these portraits are actually of like his close friends and mentors throughout his life. And the studio itself becomes a really interesting metaphor if we think about like these societal norms and structures that are imposed on everybody. And so, and especially if we think about the norms in the way that we talk about like queer identity. So they become, so we'll get into this in the next image when we actually can see the landscape, but in the sense, the only natural thing in these photographs are the subjects themselves, and the structures that surround them are like undeniably unnatural, which I think is also a reference to how unnatural like a lot of the norms that are placed on us by society in terms of what relationships we are supposed to have and we're not supposed to have are. Also, creating this work within like the natural landscape is really key to this work because it relates back to how nature is cited by like a lot of opponents of queer relationships. So often we hear like conservative politicians talking about gay marriage being like unnatural. So he's kind of reappropriating this idea of nature to use it to his advantage in this work. As a part of the acquisition, we also got this photograph of his setup of the image, which I really think begins to drive home this idea that we're talking about, because he's really setting up this unnatural structure to photograph something very natural that exists in the landscape. And we can also see that he's shooting with an 8x10 camera, which is the same camera that a lot of these older photographers who are working with landscape were often using. So in doing so, he's also starting to acknowledge the limited representation of non-straight individuals within this landscape tradition. And he really begins to kind of subvert these expectations of that tradition and like create a kind of new lens for us to actually analyze this entire genre of nature photography that is up to like very recently has been mostly elevated the voices of white male photographers. I also think this is just a pretty beautiful image in its own right, even though it's just picturing kind of the behind the scenes of making his 8x10 image. Oh, and I'll look at some questions now to see. Oh, was Bridges inspired by George Steinmetz? That I don't know, but knowing Steinmetz's work, I could imagine so, but I don't know the exact dates of when Steinmetz was working, so I can't be totally sure. And then are they able to view as a stereoscope? I'm guessing that's a reference to the Klett images, and I am not quite sure. I know that the initial photographs that he was rephotographing were typically viewed with the stereoscopes, but I don't know if he actually made his own stereoscopes. That would be a pretty cool thing if he did, though. And if anyone's wondering, like the stereoscopes are some of the initial prints that they would make with the album and prints, which are two images next to each other, and they would use something I believe called a stereoscope or a stereograph that you would move in and out in order to change the depth of field of the image. And it would work really well in these old landscape images because you could see the vastness of the images. So it was a really interactive way to play with images. You can still find them. I was looking for them on eBay the other day, and you can still find them for like anywhere from $20 to $100. So if anyone's interested, you should definitely check those out. So next is Justine Carlin. Unfortunately, this is the only image of hers that we have in our collection, but I believe it's like a pretty amazing project. So this image is from her body of work titled Girl Pictures. And she made images of teens as part of her road trip across the country. And I love this work because all the images seem to have this element of candidness to them. And most of them I'm asking like, how the hell did she get access to that scenario? But every single image is staged with these girls, and she actually casted them in the locations that she stopped in. And many of you will be surprised will not be surprised to hear that she studied at Yale with Gregory Crutzen, who is known for his very large scale staged images. But these are obviously staged like on a much smaller scale. And although this image itself is like fairly peaceful, many of her other images have this element of like lawlessness and rebellion, often depicting these girls like off the grid, doing different acts from like carrying a dead armadillo to sleeping in the desert to like urinating next to the highway. They kind of remind me of if someone was photographing like a female punk rock band traveling the US. So I'll keep going. So the next image is by Barbara Diener, and she's actually an alumni of Columbia College Chicago and a friend of the MoCP. So her work is titled Sesunt from this series. And Sesunt doesn't have an English translation, but essentially means one of life's longings for someone or something that cannot be fully defined and will not be realized. So the title encapsulates Diener's like experience coming to the US as a German immigrant in early adulthood. And she was really motivated by this longing for rootedness and this comfort of home. So she began photographing in these rural towns throughout Illinois and looking for these things that triggered her memories. So it is spelled Sehnsucht. It's a German word. So this sparked a larger investigation into this idea of home and our connection as humans to specific locations. So while at their essence, these photographs are documents made within like this specific community and these specific locations, all of her work carries a spiritual and emotional undercurrent, which kind of helps to examine her own complicated identity and place within all of this. And she even says that the landscape also becomes a character in her work. And I realize that the two images that I selected from this work are devoid of people, but I should note that her other images often contain like buildings, interiors, and portraits. And when they come together, they really become this cohesive photographic language, which to me describes the emotional landscape of the term Sesunt much better than like the English language ever could. And I actually chose these two today because I also love how they foreshadow her future work, which came after this. Because if we think about like the medium of photography and what can and can't be photographed, it is incredibly hard to photograph things like spirituality or magic, which are so intangible. But she does exactly that in her next book. And her next book is basically this investigation of photographs that examine that idea. I'm going to try to speed through some of these because I realize we're almost out of time. So next is Anmi Lei's work. And this is a particularly fun work to show in print viewings and when we do tours, because we usually ask, like, what do you think is going on in the images? And usually there's a range of guesses from like fireworks to battle. But inevitably, usually the class decides that they think it is like a war scene. So what this actually is an image made at night at the 29 Palms military base in California, where Marines train before being deployed to like Iraq or Afghanistan. And the base is actually designed in a way that it kind of mimics the landscape of Iraq. And they even build these buildings that are that kind of look like these facades of different buildings that you might see. And they even recreate like anti-American graffiti and things like that, and have people act as if they're Iraqi policemen or other things. So Anmi Lei is a Vietnamese artist who came to the United States as a refugee in 1975. And if you think about history, that's right as the Vietnam War was ending. And she began making work in the US to kind of understand our fascination with recreating war. She initially was photographing people who recreate these Vietnam War scenes in the forests of Virginia, and that was a body of work called Small Wars. this work, the 29 Palms work, kind of reflected on the differences between the Vietnam War, which was heavily televised, and the Iraq War and wars in Afghanistan, which we almost see nothing of as American citizens. So much like what we have access to, which is very curated by the US government, Leigh's work presents like no gore, no shocking imagery, and only shows us these rehearsals of these battles in these very, very descriptive images. So she's basically showing us like the theaters where these fictions are performed. This is another one by her, which again, she's also referencing some of these older Civil War photographers. Like I mentioned before, some of them would use artifice in their work to make it more dramatic. So she's also referencing this artifice by using a large format camera, similar to what they would use. But of course, she has access to better materials, so she could actually stop the action and photograph things that were in motion. And I think that her work really starts to question this idea of photographic truth. I mean, if we can show this scene and guess that it could have been taken somewhere in Iraq, then it really makes us start to think about how these documents are used and what these documents even mean, and the inherent fiction and ambiguity in some of these documents. She also won a MacArthur grant recently, so as you can tell, she is like really riding the wave right now, which is great. I'm going to try to speed through to our last artist because I know we're already over time a little bit. So last but certainly not least, I wanted to end it with David Taylor's work called Working the Line. He's always been fascinated with landscape as a way to address historical and cultural questions, and this work along the US-Mexican border is no different to me. So these monuments were set in the 1850s by surveyors, or many of them were set in the 1850s by surveyors after the Gadsden Purchase, which effectively purchased the northern chunk of Mexico, which actually Tucson, the place that I'm in right now, was purchased as part of the Gadsden Purchase. So he was interested in how these monuments could bear witness to many of the physical and political changes in the region. So he also, in doing this work, encountered a lot of surprising things like drug smugglers, migrants, and he got really intimate access in Border Patrol operations. So that also becomes a big part of that work. And the title actually comes from the Border Patrol referring to working along the border as line work. And I wanted to end it with this because I think it gets back to this idea of surveying, because these were literally the monuments that these surveyors had to set in the 1800s when we acquired this land as part of the Gadsden Purchase. And this is the last image of the set. It doesn't contain any of the physical monuments, but I just thought I'd include it because I think it's like a pretty amazing visualization of the physical implications that these political and historical events can actually have on the landscape. And if we like even think about how wildlife moves through the landscape, this can be pretty imposing. And if you're interested in that, there's an artist named Alex Turner who actually studied under David Taylor, who's doing some pretty great work about how people move through this landscape as a result of the border. So yeah, is there any last questions before I plug our future events? And sorry for going over a few minutes, guys. And yes, that's a great shout out to Millie Tibbs, Dana Fritz, Judy Natal, and Terry Evans. I almost included Terry Evans because she's some great work here as well, but that's thank you for mentioning that, Margaret. So I'll just plug some upcoming events here. So this Friday we have Behind the Lens with Cecil McDonald Jr. And that'll be this Friday, April 10th at noon. And be sure to tune into that one. Cecil is pretty amazing. He's a wonderful educator. And I don't know the name of Alex Turner's work, but if you like Google Alex Turner, or I can provide a link as well, his work will come up, and it's all stuff that's taken with like tracking cams in the night. And I also want to plug our next photos at Zoom, which is going to be on color theory with Dylan Yarbrough. And that should be really interesting. So please tune in. Thanks, Daniel. That's a link to Alex Turner's site there. And yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. So we can post these, the references that I mentioned on the Photos at Zoom page, I believe. So I will send links to them and they will be able to post them right to the site.